The last place I want to talk about in period antecedent to the suppression of suppression itself is Rome. That may surprise you, but as Clement XIII once said to Father Lorenzo Ricci, the general, your most implacable enemies are not outside Rome itself. There were several groups in Rome who were bitterly opposed to the society. First, there was a fairly large coterie of Jansenist clerics, not bad men, but quite convinced that the society, as I had said briefly somewhat earlier, was a danger to the church from the point of view of dogmatic and moral theology. Dogma in the way in which you looked at the sovereignty of God and grace and free will, and moral theology in what they regarded as laxist confessional practices on the part of his society. There had even been a plot to attempt to close the schools already as early as the late 1600s because the Jesuits were supposedly laxist. It didn't get very far, but one of the favorites of or confidants, I should say, of Innocent XI, who himself was a rather rigorous pope, was pushing that kind of thing. Besides the Jansenists, secondly, there were, for want of a better term, the critics of the accommodationist tendencies of the Jesuits. That is, the adaptationist tendencies or tactics of the missionary society in China with the Chinese rites, the veneration of Confucius, and the veneration of ancestors with Ricci, and de Nobili with his accommodationist tactics or strategies in India toward the conversion of people. It was watering down, supposedly, the traditions, the practice, and indeed even the dogma and church revelation in favor of gaining converts in the minds of those people in Rome who were fiercely opposed to the society for those reasons. De Nobili in India in the 17th century had gone to India and very rapidly was convinced that conversion would be impossible among the higher caste, the influential in India, unless the Jesuits themselves adopted the way, pardon me, the way of life which was familiar or which was recognized and respected among the Hindus, the way of life of holy people. So de Nobili shaved his head, shaved his beard, wore Hindu the garments of the sannyasi, fasted the way they did, ate only the things they did, separated himself off, and this was a tactic that brought up a lot of questions, separated himself off from all but the upper caste Hindus, because to have been involved with lower caste people would immediately have defiled him and rendered it impossible for any higher caste person to deal with him. There were real questions about what was going on, what was the greater good, to what degree. Certainly, some of his brethren were bitterly opposed to him. Some of his other brethren really thought this was the very best thing to do. Missionaries from other orders, there as in China, were quite concerned and regularly wrote to Rome about the betrayal of the gospel on the part of de Nobili there and of Ricci and his successors in China. They were different ways of approaching a conversion, or you could hardly get to the point at which you'd call it an ecumenical approach yet. In de Nobili's case, it was putting himself in the circumstances of those people respected by the Hindus for their sobriety and their sanctity, especially by the higher caste Hindus. In China, it was accommodationist tactics and strategy in the light of what was part of all of Chinese culture and civilization, where Confucius entered into the life and times without people even thinking about it. Unfortunately, one thing is certainly true. Confucius was under a sort of a baseline underlying so much of Chinese civilization. It's true. The Jesuits, at that time at least, did not recognize how important Taoism was also, and how much superstition was involved with Taoism. They rather took the line of the Confucianists, and they used their influence at the court. De Nobile was not at the courts in any way, although some Jesuits at an earlier time, for example, the nephew of Francis Xavier, was a very important man at the Mughal court in India. In any case, that's a little bit about the accommodationist tactic. Remember that everything I'm saying in these presentations, the whole thing, is, as Samuel Johnson, the great English writer, once said, I here rise to the grandeur of generalizations. So remember, this is simplifying things. You have to keep that in mind as I'm making generalizations or generalized statements here. I hope they're not false, but they certainly are generalist. Thirdly, in the Rome as hostile to the society were a good number of people in the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. Earlier, I had mentioned that at the Vatican, in the Holy See, there was no central agency for interested, in conversion or the propagation of the faith among people who were non-Christians until 1622. That wasn't that there hadn't been missionary work, but that was carried on by the various missionary orders, the Society, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, etc., etc. But a central office, no. It was at the suggestion, probably, of one of the Jesuits, or several of the Jesuits, that the Holy See set up this congregation to work with that, without realizing on either side some of the implications of that. If you set up a Holy See congregation with jurisdiction over the missionary efforts of the church, what jurisdiction do they have over the various orders? And how do they apportion out the various places where orders are working? What happened after a while was the congregation took over the apportionment of various countries as the proper place for Jesuits, Dominicans, Franciscans to work in, and even within countries, certain areas. One of the most egregious examples of that was the fact that at one point, during the course of the history of the society and the old society, there were 6 or so attempts, and a couple of them successful, to go into Tibet, either to stay there for a while or through Tibet, as Jesuits took the land route to China. For a while, there was at least there were 3 Jesuits who lived in Lhasa, living with and discoursing with the Tibetan lamas there on Tibetan philosophy and religion. After a while, the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith decided that Tibet was rather the territory of one group of the Franciscans. The Jesuits had to leave after spending years trying to get to understand what this was all about. The new missionaries came without knowing a word of Tibetanese, without knowing a thing about the country, without knowing a thing about the philosophy, the religion, the civilization, the history, or anything in the place. But that was their missionary territory. And eventually you had disputes among the officials of the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, who tended to be more rigorous than the Jesuits, and the Jesuits themselves, about jurisdiction, about territory, and again about the accommodationist tactics. It was so bad that in 1677, the hostile reports that came back from propaganda people in the various missions, hostile to the Jesuit missions, moved people at the propagation office in Rome to try to get the society, to get the Holy See to forbid the society to take any novices at all into the society, without the general having been consulted on this or informed at all. The general at the time, finding out about this, went to the Pope, who, without repudiating his own people in his own congregation, said, oh no, that was just a warning about something that might possibly have happened. It's not true. People in the congregation were really trying to get, a slow death for the society. And finally, in the Congregation of the Holy Office, or to give it its full title at the time, the Supreme Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office for the Inquisition into and the rooting out of heretical depravity, there were several of the members of the Holy Office who were ardently, several of the cardinal members, ardently anti-Jesuit. One of them, named Passionei, was head of the Roman Jansenists. Several others, Spinelli, Tamburini, Orsini, hostile to the society in the middle of the 18th century, the 1730s, 40s, 50s, and so on. One of the cardinals in Rome boasted that he had the largest anti-Jesuit library in all of Rome, and another one of them boasted that he had knowingly never read, never, ever read a book that was written by a Jesuit. So, by the time you got to the 1760s, there was what was known to later history in Rome as the conciliabulum, the little council, the little committee that met every week or second week at the Chiesa Nuova, one of the great churches in Rome, composed of, for example, Bottari, who was the prefect of the Vatican Library. No, that was Bottari, yes, and Boitari, one of the main people in the congregation of the Oratory, Cardinal Neri Corsini, and the general of the Augustinians, who was so implacably hostile to the Jesuits that at the time of their suppression or their dissolution in Spain, he had a public mass read of thanksgiving that finally this cancer at the heart of the church was being excised. As I said, Clement XIII had remarked to Father Ricci, the society's greatest enemies are not outside of Rome. Clement XIII himself was an ardent supporter of the society, and he suffered for it because he would not listen at all to the possibilities of suppression of the society. The Neapolitans invaded part of the papal territory at the edge of Neapolitan and papal borders at Benevento, and the French simply marched in and occupied Avignon, which had been papal territory for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it was made clear to Clement XIII that he'd never get that territory back unless and until he was favorable to and took steps toward the suppression of the society itself. In those circumstances, you had the one great support of the society in Clement XIII, and the other great support, of course, in the general of the society, Father Lorenzo Ricci, who was general from 1758 until 1773 at the time of the suppression, and died in 1775. He had been the secretary to the former general of the Jesuits, and at the general congregation that voted on the successor, there were two opinions. One was we should have a general that would be vigorous, firm, direct, and simply confront what was obviously a concerted effort to destroy the society. And on the other side, no, a general that would never win out in that kind of a set of circumstances because the forces against us were so great. The only thing he could do was, at the best, to move the society to prayer, that God would avert this against us, and take quiet, slow, discreet measures, supporting the Pope in his, support of the society, and hope and pray for the best, because in the minds of the people on that side, it was inconceivable to them that God would have allowed the suppression of the society. There were Jesuits then, and maybe there are now, who confound or confuse the good of the society with the good of the whole church, or the welfare of the society with the welfare of the whole church. So he suggested that that particular group suggested be silent, be patient, be prayerful. And it was that kind of a person, Ricci, who was elected, a man whom I regard as a real saint. He will never be canonized, I assure you, because they'd have to dredge up all of the kinds of things, we'll talk about them a little later, that people in the Holy See did after they imprisoned him. What had been happening meanwhile to all of these Jesuits who from 1759 at the earliest up until now in the 1770s had been either exiled from their country or at least forbidden, like Spain and Portugal, are forbidden to live as Jesuits in, pardon me, in France. What had happened to them? Well, a fair number, most of them were, except for France, most of them were on the property and in the territory of the Holy See in Rome, supported with whatever small resources the society had, and with a pension from Clement XIII, constantly recognizing that they were in a very anomalous situation. They were not Italian. Some of them couldn't speak Italian. They couldn't engage in apostolic work very easily. They were crowded into makeshift houses. A fair number, fairly early, asked for dispensations from their vows, in other words, to leave the society. That didn't, under any circumstance, mean, if they were priests, that they were, absolved from the obligations of clerical celibacy or the office. They simply became, that would have been unthinkable at the time, they simply became diocesan priests, in a sense shifting as well as they could on their own. They left, we don't know how many. We've never been able to figure out, whatever happened to all of them, whatever happened to them, who they were, and what it was that happened. The ones that stayed in the society were leading an increasingly precarious existence, and some of them, as I had mentioned more to several people at one or another time, Ricci complained that having lived in the peace and quiet of the cloister, notice cloister of the society, they were now made giddy by the delights of a large city such as Rome. That's where we were when Clement XIII died, as I told you, and as I began this whole thing in 1769.